at Virginia Tech University. He'll be reacting to the comments and reactions and analysis of the speakers and the panelists. Let me come straight to you, if I may, Vanda, to sort of, tell us how we got here and where do we go from here, essentially? What are the key distinguishing features of these different militias and armed non-state actors? How do policymakers grapple with this? And indeed, how do we as analysts, scholars, observers try and dissect some of these issues and get to the bare bones of it all? The floor is yours, Vanda.
Well, thank you very much, Ranj. It's a real pleasure to partner up with you for this webinar and to have you as a colleague in the initiative of Non-State Armed Actors at Brookings. Just a delight working with you, and a superb delight also to be sharing this conversation with a terrific panel. So I look very much forward to our exchanges and our mutual exploration of the issue. All of us, of course, have been living with the impact of COVID, which has been dramatic in its strategic, economic, social, and public health implications, really surpassing a devastation of many a regional war. COVID also has had profound effects on non-state armed actors to a large extent, though not uniformly and in the same way, empowering them. It's something that I will come to in a minute, but of course, non-state armed actors have not emerged or achieved the ascendance range that you spoke about simply on the basis of COVID. Even prior to COVID, the reality was that hundreds of millions of people around the world were governed by non-state armed actors, whether those were militias, militants of different ideological orientations, or whether they were criminal groups. Those actors might not have fully controlled the territory, the territory might have been contested, but nonetheless, the daily life decisions of people were arbitrated, decided by those armed actors. And very often those armed actors, criminal or militant, were also the basic providers of any kind of public goods, as well as any kind of livelihoods for those populations. Well, COVID has, in a sense, deeply intensified those dynamics, but it had another effect as well. It severely weakened and shaped the capacities of many states. So several months ago, when I saw the last estimate, some 200 million people were pushed by COVID into extreme poverty. This number is probably a severe underestimate of the actual people. Think about it. 150, 200 million people plus pushed into extreme poverty as a result of COVID. The first 20 weeks of COVID wiped out 20 years of anti-poverty efforts, and wiped them out in ways that for many of the people who were unfortunate to slide from the middle class, lower middle class status they achieved back into poverty, will not be able to recover in their lifetime. It was not just that people lost jobs in large parts of the world. They had to liquidate all of their productive assets. They would lose access to education. They would lose access to cell phones. That meant that even children could not participate in any kind of remote schooling because they would not be able to plug into the internet. We saw in large parts of Latin America, GDPs collapsing by 10%. In places like Mexico, 8% GDP loss. Across Latin America overall, it's the worst economic situation since 1840, not 1940, 1840. And while in some of the more developed parts of the world, like North America or China, economies are rapidly rebounding with the easing of the public health crisis, that has not been the case in many other parts of the world, like Africa, where economies continue stagnating and deep in recession, or in various parts of Latin America and elsewhere. So what has that meant for states? Well, for states, it has meant that discretionary budget and spending capacity radically shrunk. That also means that money for both any kind of socioeconomic development, public livelihoods, economic livelihoods, any kind of offsetting mechanisms has shrunk. But it also meant that, that budgets for many militaries and police forces have shrunk. Often in contests where police forces and military forces tend to be very brutal, often deeply committing crimes that are egregious human rights violations and that push citizens into the hands of non-state armed actors. So around the world, non-state armed actors have, in different ways, used COVID to increase their strength. They have often tightened their hold on populations, restricted social mobility, restrict physical mobility as well as social mobility, often using the justification of the need for lockdown to strengthen their hold on governance, eliminated, often targeted any kind of civil society activist, independent sources of power, very rarely suspended their violent actions. In fact, around the world, we've seen the most powerful armed groups significantly upping the military fight and often being very successful in the military fight. And all of them, in one way or another, responded with the provision of some sort of offsetting mechanism that has ranged. Shabab, for example, has been telling people that they can provide medication for COVID, even though this is not true. The medications are not effective, but there's a striking difference in how Shabab behave. Shabab is the militant group in Somalia, I should have said, during the famine in 2011. The Taliban has invited humanitarian actors to provide responses and said it would guarantee security to them for providing medical access, treatment, masks, other kind of responses to COVID. Again, switching how it behaved even a year prior, when it believed that international medical and humanitarian actors were spies for the United States. Other groups have behaved in different way, but they all essentially use COVID to increase their hold on population, more deeply entrench their power. And if they were particularly sophisticated armed groups, to rule not just through coercion, but also through delivery of at least semi-public goods. And my final comment here is that many of the people who have been pushed into poverty, of course, are now dependent on illegal economies for their livelihoods and will be dependent on those illegal economies for years, perhaps decades to come, which once again means that those who will mitigate their daily life, those who will manage, arbitrate how they go about their lives will be non-state armed actors, while states and international actors might often feel that they will need to respond to them negatively. And sorry, one last comment. I said my prior to last comment was this. My truly last comment is that, of course, very often the relationship between armed non-state armed actors and the state is not fully or wholly antagonistic. That even in areas of contestations, there are actual arrangements, negotiations. Governments regularly engage with non-state armed actors. They sometimes devolve power, even just de facto, to non-state armed actors, sometimes through negotiated arrangements that applies also to criminal groups. And the weaker the state is, the more coercively it tends to react on the one hand, but also the more it will find it necessary to find accommodations with non-state armed actors. And that has profound implications for international actors and our own sense that an appropriate response to a group like Shabab is always a coercive strength, or a group like a Mexican cartel, a highly violent group, where in some cases the negotiation engagement might also be spilling into the international domain, especially as we will see actors like the Taliban likely come to formal power. With that, let me hand it over to my colleagues.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Vanda. That was very helpful indeed. More than just a scene setter, in fact. You know, the questions of engagement, coercion, you sort of touched on the symbiosis that exists between these different actors, the conventional and unconventional. What I understood from your remarks was that armed non-state actors, as seems to be the case, are better positioned or better, let's say, adept at reacting to crises and turn them into opportunities. And with that, I would like to ask Fred to come in, based on his extensive analysis of North Africa, Libya, and beyond, because this I guess goes to the very heart of the problem that policymakers, especially in respect of SSR and DDR, face, where although you might be trying to address one set of issues in the immediate aftermath of conflict, perhaps, or even in the midst of conflict, you then have other crises, whether it's COVID, whether it's some political crises, whether it's some externally imposed crisis that then adds to the problem. And in those cases, as Vanda sort of alluded to, it's the armed non-state actors that continue to thrive. So, where does one go from here, and with that in mind? The floor is yours, Fred. You're on mute.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you so much, Raj, for the introduction, and thanks to the Crisis Response Council for having me speak. Yeah, I mean, these questions are just so pertinent, and I want to sort of pick up on something Vanda said at the end about how states devolve power to armed groups, and this very blurred line between armed groups and the states, and specifically look at the case of Libya and extract some lessons learned from a near decade of failed SSR and DDR in Libya. And a lot of the questions that this panel is addressing really weighed on me heavily when I first went to Libya after the fall of Gaddafi in 2012. And I was struck the way, US diplomats, US military attaches, people from the international community were really struggling to make sense of this new security sector landscape. You had the decrepit Gaddafi era police and army that had vanished, and you had the plethora of armed groups, many of which claimed affiliation to the new state, the new political authorities. They had folded under the ministries of Interior, Defense, but there were questions, how and whether should we engage with these, armed groups. And throughout the years, policymakers, when looking at Libya, they often had a very artificial dividing line between, militias on the one hand and the state on the other. And what we now know in the case of Libya is that those lines are blurred. The militias are part of the state. Libya's landscape can be defined as one of hybridity or security pluralism, where you have informal, formal actors working in tandem on security governance. And this raises a whole set of questions about policy. Now, early on, it was very interesting in Libya that the USAID, they did a survey of armed groups, and they found that a lot of armed groups in Libya were sort of community service providers, community police providers, right? They had social ties to their communities, and this report said, look, many of them are well disciplined. They can be mobilized to fill the security vacuum. That proved to be a vast overstatement of that benign aspect of the armed groups. And what we now know over the years is that many armed groups became politicized, ideological, very communal, localized. They captured vast, organs of the state. They colonized ministries. They started raiding the state, coffers. And all of this is to say that I think the Libya case points to the importance of having a good understanding of the typology, of armed groups in a conflict setting, and, understanding their communal, ideological makeup, but also their internal structure. What's their command structure? How is information disseminated to their members? And what are their external influences, to include foreign patronage, foreign equipment, foreign funding? And I think the funding issue is key. Are these groups extractive, right? Are they predatory? Are they engaged in the illicit economy? Or do they receive funding from the state? And I think that will give you certain levers that you can work in terms of tools like conditionality on funding, and we can talk about those in the discussion. I think another important characteristic of armed groups is their permeability to social influences, to their community, right? Do they respond to players like tribal notables, civil society? And then that also presents policy options where you engage those societal actors to moderate armed group behavior. And in the case of Libya, you're not going to do away with these armed groups, but you're trying to incentivize them to provide security as a public good rather than a private good. We can get into various tools to try to do this. You know, in the case of Libya, you know, while we're trying to make sense of these armed groups, there was often a temptation in Libya to do train and equip, right? To stand up a new central security force from scratch, right? And outsiders tried to do this, and it failed repeatedly, right? For multiple reasons, for the vetting of recruits, for the sheer timeline that, you know, to build an army from scratch. I mean, the projection in Libya was, you know, 7 years, and what's going to happen in the interim? Who's filling that security vacuum? So I always talk about this very tempting option of, okay, we're just going to create an army. It didn't work in the case of Libya, and in many cases, the recruits for this new force came from a very specific tribal or communal background, right? So what you were basically doing is creating a new, you know, a new militia. There were instances, especially in Libya, where you needed to work with the armed groups, engage them on a specific task, a specific mission. And here I'm thinking about counterterrorism. And, you know, the US went down that path, right? It had to fight the Islamic State. And I think the lesson from the engagement against the Islamic State in 2016, where the US and the British provided support to armed groups that were nominally under the unity government, is you engage them with very limited technical task-specific support for that specific mission that cannot be used later on to entrench their power or to create militia competition or go after their rivals. And we can debate this, but I do think the counter-ISIS campaign was an example, a positive example of working through armed groups for a specific, you know, task. You know, more broadly, I think the Libya case illustrates ways that we can think about how to tether very localized armed groups to the state, you know, through local security or governance organs like municipal councils. There's also a structure in Libya called operations rooms, where you have a coordinating mechanism that basically apportions policing tasks to informal actors, formal actors like the police. Again, these sorts of structures are not the ideal, right? But they're an interim solution to, you know, to security. And we can also talk about some sort of umbrella structure like a National Guard. Our discussant Ariel Ahram and I wrote a paper on this. Again, certainly fraught with risks, but it is an option on the table in Libya, and it was actually proposed in several instances by the UN, by the State Department. Another point in Libya is, you know, given Libya's oil wealth, Libya has had these sort of very attractive assets that have become sources of militia competition, right? And obviously the oil wealth, the state coffers, but also things like ministries, ports, airports. And so these are strategic prizes. And I think, you know, conceptually, is there a way that the international community can fence off those assets from militia competition, safeguard them? And here, especially the oil wealth, there's a lot of retrospective thinking that early after the fall of Gaddafi, the transitional authorities, they started diverting the oil wealth to the armed groups, and that created this monster that we have today. And, you know, had there been greater oversight or scrutiny of that important, you know, oil resource and how it was spent, it might have mitigated some of the problems of the armed groups. But this goes to the whole question of sovereignty and international, you know, oversight. Let me just close with a few sort of thoughts, further thoughts. Again, in the case of Libya, I think we should avoid an excessively materialist or economic focus to dealing with the armed groups. You know, there's this recurring theme in policy that, you know, it's all about the money, right? These armed groups, you know, we can buy them off, right? We can pay them and that will somehow co-opt them. Or if we simply turn off the spigot, right? We cut off the funding, that will somehow, you know, settle it down, right? And I think obviously money is an important driver for these armed groups, how they sustain themselves, how they pay themselves, and it's a source of competition, right? But it's not the whole story, right? I mean, the armed groups are these young men that are in the armed groups. They're motivated by group and communal identity, things like collective memory, history, religion, ideology, and those human factors, I think, are so important to keep in mind, but they're also exceedingly difficult to address, you know, with traditional policy and technocratic tools. And I'll just stop there and turn it over to you.
Thanks very much indeed, Fred. A lot of food for thought there. I am tempted to ask you on the about the implementation, the execution, of the concepts, the ideas, the policies. Perhaps a question for you to think about, and maybe Benedetta could even respond to this in her presentation, her initial intervention. At what cost? So sometimes it's a question of it's down to the locals, the country itself to address these issues. It can't all be done by external actors. So I guess the question really is whether it's the US, the Europeans, the likes of NATO, and so forth. Up to what point should these actors, get their hands dirty, in quotation marks, of course, and at what cost? Is there a cutoff point where perhaps the support in a very broad sense can start to become part of the problem and not the solution itself? So something for you to think about there, Fred. And I think this is a great opportunity to bring you in, Benedetta. I always refer to international organizations, institutions, as critical as they are and as fundamental as they are, as rather rigid, bureaucratic beasts that perhaps in some cases aren't really well suited to these hybrid security orders, but not necessarily in the negative sense, in that it's not a question of one or the other. It's simply a reality, and as policymakers, we have to find ways of integrating the strengths of the different external actors and everything they have to offer. So I'd like to bring you in to obviously react to what you've heard so far, but also how can SSR approaches, how can the likes of NATO adapt to these increasingly complex and challenging security environments? The floor is yours, Benedetta.
Thank you, and thank you also for framing the dilemma, right? Because I would argue this is, of course, not just an issue that pertains to NATO per se as an organization. It is a dilemma that really is highly pertinent to virtually all international, whether multilateral or bilateral international efforts to invest in SSR and DDR. But I'll just piggyback on some of the really good remarks I've heard so far to sort of go into the policy question. Where are we and where should we go? And I think I might also use some of my some personal remarks based on the fact that in my pre-NATO day, I spent more than a decade on the field working on these issues. And in my free time, I'm completing now a book on non-state armed governors in the Middle East. So I'll mix it up and be a little bit personal, because this way I can also be more frank. So that way, I would start by saying it is clear that there is a mismatch between a state-centered model of security assistance and the reality on the ground. And I don't think that's very contentious statement. On the one hand, the dominant model of SSR is state-centered. It looks at how to build stability by building up the central state, by investing in boosting the capacity and the ability of the security sector at large and the armed forces in particular. It looks at non-statutory actors as anomalies. So militias, non-state armed groups in general are supposed to be a temporal glitch in the system waiting to be resolved by either integrating, dismantling, or finding another solutions to return to the state center normative model. And they are looked mostly as potential spoilers and mostly through a security prism rather than as governance providers or as political actors. That's the theory. Then you have the reality on the ground. And of course, the reality on the ground is that the assumption that the normative model of provision of security is the state-based one is built on largely a fiction. For many countries, many millions of people in the world, having a rigid monopoly of the role of force held by the state and the state as the sole provider of security, that's mostly a fiction in a large part of the world. It's especially a fiction if you look at post-conflict societies or fragile states in general, where of course the regular model is the one that has been discussed so far. It's a hybrid model, it's a mediated model where the providers of security, some are state-based, some are non-state-based, some are state-affiliated, some are in open competition with the state, but more often than not, it is a network. And these relationships are incredibly dynamic. The reality on the ground is therefore that building and betting only on the state is simply it's nice in theory, in practice, it just misses the reality, which is far more plural. Then that ergo, one of the other main assumptions, which is the non-state is it's the anomaly, the exception, doesn't really work on the ground. So the impetus to implement policies to make them go away inevitably fails, because they're not going to go away, because they are an embedded, pervasive and persistent feature of the security landscape. So there is a big mismatch there. The other mismatch is because we tend to look at them solely through a spoiler lens, which in many cases is a very accurate description, but it's by no means sufficient. We need to look at them as dynamic spoilers or contributors to stability, which makes the way we engage them which should make the way we engage them far more nuanced than what our existing regulatory frameworks often allows us to do. And finally, because we tend to look at SSR and DDR as security only or technical exercises, we often miss on the political dimension, and we often miss on understanding that especially in a context of limited statehood, the ability to mobilize armed force is key to mobilizing political capital, and is key to these actors' ability to actually use their ability to command armed struggle as one of the key tools they have to renegotiate their social political position in the polity, and by doing so becoming power brokers. So they have political agency, and that's a very tricky balance to strike. So where are we left? We're left with, I think, a growing understanding that there is this gap, but there is no easy fix, because there is no perfect solution. If on the one hand you say we have a good framework and we need to stick to it, there is a high price to pay. You sometimes don't engage with the right actors. You may pour money into security apparatuses that are not going to deliver no matter how much you pump them up. You may try to build security sectors in the mirror image of the textbook Western style security sector reform process, and you may fail. So you may really fall short in effectiveness. But the opposite side of the equation, which is, well, then let's just lift the ban and engage whoever is more effective, it's also very problematic, because in some cases it may create destabilization of the state. In other cases, it may amount to external intervention de facto. Let's not forget security assistance is done in partnership with the state. So going behind their back when there is a clash between the state and the non-state actors is de facto external intervention. So we're entering in a very different territory from security assistance. And even when there is cooperation, do we want to engage and give recognition without having levers to demand accountability when it comes to sticking to the rule of law or complying with human rights or other type of conditionality that we are able to put in our relationship with the state? So that means, and because a matter of time, because of the limited time, I'm going to sum up quickly and say there is no perfect solution. I think the best we can do is to have principle-based approach and principles that we apply in looking at how to engage non-state armed groups in general. I think principle one is there is no size one fit all. It's context driven, and even in that context, it's flexible, it's fluid, it changes. We need to be more nimble and more flexible in our approaches and change as the realities on the ground change. And that requires much more local knowledge, but also much more involvement of local expertise. So including much more relations with the civil society. Again, not easier said than done. Point two, I think we need to lose the illusion that security assistance can be non-political. It cannot be. It is incredibly political. There is nothing more political than the provision of security. It is the essence of statehood. So when we grant it or withdraw it, there is a political dimension, and that requires sometimes a very difficult policy choices. But I think sometimes we tend to retrench into the very normative and technocratic language, and that tends to obliviate the fact that in reality we are engaged in a political dynamic. And thirdly, I personally think that it is very hard to do, but it's it is important in thinking about legitimacy to think about output-driven legitimacy, by which I mean that stateness itself is not by itself a criteria for legitimacy. And conversely, non-statutory nature of a group, it's not by itself a reason why that group is not legitimate. I think legitimacy should be far more linked to output legitimacy, so the ability to actually do what you say you're doing, in that case, deliver security, and local acceptance of the group as legitimate. And the example of the post-ISIS comes to mind, of course, security provision by Shia militias in communities that do not see that presence as legitimate, or do not see that presence as really representative. And thirdly and finally, accountability. Is there a mechanism to ensure accountability when those that provide securities are not responsive and engage in violations of human rights or the rule of law? If the answer is no, then I think engagement is difficult. If the answer is yes, engagement is still difficult, but we might at least have the conversation as to whether that's worth it. I'll end here.
No, that's perfect. Thanks very much indeed, Benedetta. I mean, I think this is again, a wonderful opportunity for Yaniv to come in because of the emphasis you had, I guess, on dynamic spoilers, contributors to stability. You did finish with accountability, which is something I'm hoping we can discuss a bit more, given the increase in atrocities, the impunity with which some of these actors are operating across the region, not necessarily just one or the other. And I guess for Yaniv, the question here really is building on what Benedetta said, building on what Vanda and Fred have both highlighted in their interventions. This question of good militia, good armed non-state actor, bad militia, bad armed non-state actor. I mean, that's a simplification, of course, but is it possible to start to, distinguish the features that would ideally comprise the so-called good militia or armed non-state actor or political movement, one that international actors can work with, that do have legitimacy, from those more malign actors that are more predatory, that do inflict systemic suffering and abuses on the local populations. And international norms, we talk a lot about international norms in this day and age, the rules-based international order. Are there certain groups that are perhaps more compatible with that, that paradigm, let's say? The floor is yours, Yaniv.
Excellent, thank you very much. And I think what I have to say corresponds a lot with what my colleagues have just discussed. It's also a great opportunity to promote the paper that the center that the council will soon be republishing about this subject. So I mean, the thing is that there are certain factors that make armed groups, and particularly pro-government militias, which is what I've been focusing about. There are factors that make them more inclined toward predatory behavior than others, that make these armed groups more inclined to, more ready to violate international norms and the way they, especially in terms of how they treat local populations. And I think there are two excellent examples that I also discuss in the forthcoming report. And these examples are the Popular Mobilization Forces, or the Hashd al-Sha'bi in Iraq, and on the other hand, the Kurdish Peshmerga, right? So we have two examples of non-state armed groups that emerged under similar circumstances as part of a broader counterinsurgency framework, but have behaved very differently from each other, right? So, and my argument is that what makes an armed group, what makes a pro-government militia more predatory than others, what makes them more inclined to violate international norms is not necessarily the demographic composition, right? It's not because certain groups are worse than others or more inclined to violence than others, but their operation, or the nature of their operations. So for example, I think it's safe to say that the PMF or the Hashd have been much more inclined, have been much more capable or willing to violate international norms has to do with the nature of the operations, right? The PMF started as local militias that aimed primarily to defend their communities. But as time went by, and especially with the rise of the Islamic State in Mosul, these movements were mobilized from their regions of origin into the north, where they stopped, where suddenly they became almost something of an occupying force. They were alien to the region that they were operating in. They didn't have legitimacy, right? They didn't have the support of the local populations as they may have had, for example, when they operated, when these different militias actually operated in their regions of origin. And that made them much, this situation, this reality drove them to become much more aggressive toward the local population, much more defensive, because they faced not only the insurgency, but also the suspicion of the local populations. So this is an important, I think this is an important factor that has made the Hashd a more, again, not only engaged or in actions that violate international norms, but also dangerous to the cohesion of the Iraqi state, to the Iraqi government. Now, if we compare this, for example, to the Peshmerga, we can see great differences, right? I mean, of course, under certain circumstances, the Peshmerga, for example, have also been reported to be involved in predatory behavior or actions against civilian populations. But I think it doesn't reach the scale of violence that the PMF has used toward local populations or even toward government institutions. And again, the reason is that the Peshmerga, throughout most of the time, have operated in their regions of origin. They have operated in defense of their local populations. On top of that, the Peshmerga has also represented a separatist cause, right? I mean, of course, we can argue the Kurdistan regional government, the Kurdish movement in Iraq, would very much hesitate to describe its cause as a separatist cause. But we know that this has been in the background. And as such, I think, you know, the Peshmerga and their leaders, their patrons, have been much more sensitive about international public opinion. They've been much more sensitive about the implications of what happens if they actually violate international norms. Again, when in some of the instances, when the Peshmerga stepped out of their territories, as for example, as part of the fighting against the Islamic State, in which the Peshmerga took a very important part in, they were also accused of violating norms of fighting or targeting local populations. But these instances have been much rarer, and I think this supports what I argue about the different factors that shape the behavior of non-armed groups, right? Especially pro-government militias or paramilitary groups. Again, time is short, so I don't want to elaborate too much beyond it, but one thing that I think we have to remember about militias, about non-state armed groups, is that these forces are not just fighting forces. Of course, they're involved in fighting, pro-government militias are recruited and formed to serve as auxiliaries in counterinsurgency operations. But these forces are also social and political forces. They represent their communities. They enable their leaders and their patrons to become local power brokers. They allow them, they elevate them and enable individuals from communities that, had often been marginalized to become, to also participate in or to become part of the circles of power in their countries. So an important theme in security sector reforms literature is about the need to disband militias, about the need to disband pro-government militias. And again, I think I echo my colleagues here. I think this idea has to be much more nuanced. Certain militias, of course, must be, I think certain militias must be disbanded. For example, the PMF, if we really need to stabilize Iraq, the PMF needs to be disbanded. But localized militias probably have much more room in politics than others. So I think, and this is, if I can make a policy recommendation, that would be it. We need to position toward disbanding militias.
Well, good luck with trying to disband the PMF in Iraq. Yaniv, I wish you the best of luck with that. I mean, I am tempted to bring in Vanda before I bring in Ariel for his reactions, because I mean it's because what Yaniv was sort of alluding to is this transition that groups make from ragtag fighters, and that whether it's a question of months or years, they emerge as or ascend into political, socio-political movements with a lot more credibility and legitimacy than they started off as. So I guess this sort of transitional phase is perhaps, when it comes to sequencing as well, I guess, is rather critical in that sense. I wonder whether Vanda, you could respond to that element of this, this transitional phase that most groups seem to undertake, and sometimes, without any or limited constraints being imposed on them.
Well, thank you. Fascinating and stellar conversation so far. Perhaps in answering that, I could hit on points that a few of us have made. Essentially, any non-state armed actor, or very many non-state armed actors, certainly in the transitional phase, at some point face the decision of how they will govern. Will they govern through brutality and coercion only, or will they also try to seek legitimacy? And if they decided they also seek legitimacy, is the legitimacy going to be in any way linked to performance? The most resilient, sophisticated groups, the ones that have high longevity and perhaps a chance to become not just de facto, but de jure ruling entities, will move towards some performance-based legitimacy as part of their portfolio. But their capacities in accomplishing that varies, as does their ability to adapt, which I would say is the other second point, namely that the really competent groups that will last, like the Taliban, have the capacity to calibrate their responses to inputs from community. That doesn't mean that every single input from community is taken. There is hardly that level of directness, responsiveness, and accountability. But there is learning then when certain forms of brutality backfire too much, when certain ruling backfires too much, they will pull back. I think it was maybe Fred who was speaking about the responsiveness to communities. And this, of course, ties to the notions of accountability that Benedetta raised. But I would also highlight here that responsiveness does not equal accountability. And one factor that has not been yet mentioned that I would posit that it's critical is the level of social cohesion. If the level of social cohesion is very weak, the community has been truly fragmented, then the inputs from the community, of course, are much weaker and the responsiveness is lesser. I guess I am not fully persuaded that the local base is the full explanation to how accountable or brutal and predatory groups are. And a part of it is links to the notion of social cohesion. If social cohesion is very weak, then even a very local entity will not be getting inputs and can become very brutal. Or even if there is better social cohesion, a very local group like Boko Haram can still remain very brutal. But I also want to highlight what Fred was saying, namely that even local militias tend to become very frequently politicized, appropriated, that they enter politics. And oftentimes the level of accountability actually weakens over time. So I agree that if the group operates in in territories outside of its local base, it has perhaps higher tendency for going predatory, but I don't think that's a sufficient explanation. And if I remove us from the MENA space and think about something like Mexico, where you have two very large pan-national groups, Sinaloa Cartel and Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, you have very clear differences in responsiveness and calibration of brutality and rulings through providing some sort of public goods services, both groups that don't really have, or that operate beyond the local base. So all of these are enormously complex issues with a great deal of variability, but bringing us to the core point that getting away with the groups is extraordinarily challenging. But let's not lose sight of the fact that many of the groups are odious. They might be better than the state might be brutal, unaccountable, or altogether gone. So from a perspective of a local resident, that's what you live with. They might be better than the more chaotic, more brutal group, but they are still not nice actors. So simply allowing the militias or the non-state armed actors to exist, simply allowing Boko Haram to exist, simply allowing militias in southern Nigeria to exist, or Al-Shabaab, also comes with enormous costs beyond simply issues of international terrorism, but enormous costs to the quality of existence, to the basic humanitarian issues as well. But I'm looking forward to Ariel's comments.
Absolutely, thanks very much. And thank you also for bringing in the Latin America experience, the experience in Mexico as well, Vanda. I was hoping you would do that at some point. I mean, Ariel, in addition to reacting to what you've heard so far, we do also have a question from the audience, from Dina Ramadan, who asks, why is the engagement of non-state actors in the political process, why has it almost always been debatable on the basis of their human rights abuses, while engaging the state actor, which might have violated far more international norms, and with both sides having a similar impact on the conflict. So I guess this is on that, non-state-state divide, which goes in a way to the very heart of the discussion and debate that we're having. Ariel, the floor is yours.
Dina, I think that's a really important question. I think it's one that we haven't addressed enough as a policy community. It's certainly true that non-state actors, armed non-state actors, are responsible for a whole kind of laundry list of bad acts. And we could even begin, my interest in non-state actors began with the Janjaweed in Darfur, but we could talk also about Burma, and we could talk about cases in Mexico. There are no shortage of places to look for violations. Those, though, I think often overshadow what we've discussed here, which is that these non-state actors are part of a civil society, if they're not civil society themselves, but are part of a civil society, and are often, in some respects, the best that we could hope for in certain circumstances, and are providing certain levels of services and certain levels of protections to specific peoples and populations. I think the most important thing, though, is that, as Vanda said, they're not going away. We could talk about allowing them to exist, but we also know that it's also not up to the international community to make decisions about whether they can exist or not. They exist regardless of whether we want them to. The big comparison, armies of police that are attached to the state, I think there are much stronger levers of power from the international community to punish those groups. I don't think that it's the case that we evaluate military assistance without regard to humanitarian concerns. I think the debates right now go about whether to provide military funds to Saudi Arabia or to Israel, or in some cases to the Mexican government, to Peru, to Brazil. Those are all debates essentially about the humanitarian responsiveness of these organizations. And I think I don't think that I think that the comparisons are often done implicitly, but I think that it's not the case that state actors kind of get off scot-free and non-state actors are evaluated on an impossible moral scale. I think that it is tricky though to balance the principles, as Benedetta said. When I wrote down the 3 principles, and in the end I sort of said, well, these are kind of 3 principles to say we're not going to have a lot of principles when we're engaging with non-state actors. I think that if we're going to be context specific and understand that these are political decisions and we're going to be based on outputs instead of necessarily inputs, then the principles are kind of more like operating procedures. They're not really principles or norms. They're just kind of decision trees. This conversation to me has highlighted, I think, just how far the conversation about militias has gone and about the conversation about armed non-state actors. I know some of you have been talking about this for a long time. Ranj, Fred, we've had these conversations now close to 10 years. And it's heartening in some respects because I think that there is a recognition of some of the difficulties and some of the challenges. I want to focus on, I think of the kind of the key policy question here, which is, what are the actual levers that drive militia behavior? Are they purely fiscal? Are militias just out there for the greed? And if so, well, there should be simple policy solutions. If the state can't pay them to do the right thing, then the international community should be able to pay them to do the right thing. And it's just a question of getting the fiscal incentives right. That seems unlikely, though, right? That's if that was the only solution, then we would have solved it already. Is the question political? Again, we have this distinction between the local, the national, and then the international community. We have lots of cases where militias are or militia representatives are seated in parliament. And so they enjoy a certain kind of status in the domestic community, even though the international community has put them on watch lists and they're on the Interpol no-fly zone. But at home, we're a respected part of the political process. Or conversely, these actors are treated as illegal in the domestic arena, right? They're not allowed anywhere near the capital, and yet internationally, they're having meetings with senior CENTCOM officials or senior NATO officials because they're considered to be important or important actors. So think of the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan before 2001. And then finally, we have this normative concern, which is, I think, something that we are just now starting to appreciate. And again, there is a distinction between the norms and the values that motivate actors that might be generated from really parochial local experiences, that we are the fighters for the revolution and we defend the revolution because of this experience that we've had together as really kind of a small group fighting organization, versus norms and that come from the state about legal versus illegal and what is the designation of legality versus illegality. And then finally, norms and values that are generated at the international level about international humanitarian law and the protections of civilians, which are not insubstantial. There are lots of armed non-state actors that are quite cognizant of their standing in international law and aware that certain kinds of actions could eventually lead them to a dock at the Hague, or perhaps something even worse. And even more so, that not so much that it's punitive, but they're also aware that there are certain ways to treat populations that are better than others. That if their goal is to build legitimacy and to in some way participate in governance, whether it's as a state actor or non-state actor, these norms matter. So I think that the next question for us, maybe in a year's time, maybe in 10 years' time, I don't know, is to really parse out which levers matter and under what conditions they matter, how they can be used in a more effective way. One of the things that we have highlighted here in this conversation is, even though there's a strong sense that these groups are not going away, the policy response to their existence is still quite inconsistent and quite non-comprehensive. I'll put it in that way. And as a result, we have so many different kinds of trajectories of armed non-state actorhood and their relationships to the state. I don't think that we need a one-size-fit-all. Benedetta pointed that out. We certainly can't be one-size-fit-all, but I think that we can be more attentive as policy scholars and as thinking about the international system to what works and what doesn't work. So I'm going to throw that maybe out to the panel again to address what levers haven't been approached effectively, what levers maybe we are next on the list, and what levers maybe we have overused or put too much confidence in, and might be maybe we've overstressed them.
Sounds great. That's excellent. Thanks very much indeed, Ariel. I'll leave it to the panelists to respond to the various aspects of your let's say reactions. It's certainly multi-layered. I think that's now. So I don't envy any policymaker trying to break down this issue to its fundamentals. Let's give the audience a chance to come in. We've got a question here from Umberto Profazio. It's a very Libya-specific question directed at Fred and Benedetta. Let's Umberto, would you like to come in and ask your question? Umberto, the floor is yours. Umberto?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Please.
Yeah, thank you very much.
If you can also introduce yourself. Thanks very much.
Yes, I'm an associate fellow of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. And I met Frederic a couple of years ago, and I got a series of questions about Libya. And specifically, where do you see the security sector reform going to in the next few months or years? And how do you evaluate the Turkish security cooperation with the GNU affiliated forces, the training programs that they're doing with the military there? And for Benedetta, is there any chance for NATO to build upon this bilateral cooperation between Turkey and the GNU, and maybe move it into a multilateral framework? And what can you say that the main obstacles would be to move this bilateral cooperation into a multilateral dimension? Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Umberto. We've got another question from Jim Muir. Jim, would you like to ask your question directly? The floor is yours, Jim.
Okay, thank you very much. I just was wondering philosophically if there's anything such a thing as a good non-state armed actor. I can't think of any myself, but I'm wondering if any of you can think of situations where non-state military actors or armed actors have emerged and it could be seen as a force for good, obviously perhaps with flaws, but if you can't think of any outright, can you think of who might be the best candidates for such a label? I personally, as I say, having lived most of my life in the Middle East, my working life, I can't think of any, but maybe you guys with wider experience might be able to come up with something. Just on a minor point, I wouldn't nominate the Peshmerga because I regard them as a state force. They are essentially the Kurdish army and funded by Baghdad in that capacity.
Thanks very much. And that's Jim Muir of the BBC, unless I'm mistaken.
It is indeed. Also visiting senior fellow at the LSE Middle East Centre, I'll have you know. Thank you.
Great. Well, we'll have to have you on the panel next time, Jim.
Oh, thanks. Sure.
With pleasure. So thanks very much, Jim. So we've got two sets of questions there that actually fit very well into the interventions. One, a question directed at Fred and Benedetta, and the other would easily be directed at Vanda and Yaniv. Let's start with Libya. Fred and Benedetta, some reactions, thoughts.
Yeah, that's a great question. So basically, what we've got now is this period where we're moving toward national elections, and my fear here is that the security sector question is being deferred as it was in past political processes. And so it could be an obstacle that triggers a relapse of question of conflict. And so really there's a question really of, who owns the security sector? Who's going to be in charge of it? How are we going to structure it? And those questions are not being really addressed. There is this 5+5 joint military commission that's supposed to be talking, but that's more of a confidence building measure. It's not a basis for an architecture. And so there's real, looming, I think, danger signs on the horizon. And of course, there is the Haftar question looming in the east. The Turks, meanwhile, they're going ahead with train and equip. They're doing unit level train and equip of specific, capacities in the west, with very little forethought or consideration for how you integrate that into a national structure, civilian oversight. institutional capacity building, these sorts of things. So it's, again, the problem of sequencing. They're throwing in this train and equip. It could be, destabilizing. It's not doing anything to unify the broader security sector. So bottom line is I am worried. I'm worried about this. There's also a lot of misplaced optimism that somehow this new elected government, when it gets elected, that it will have the legitimacy to push forward DDR and SSR. And we've been through that. We've seen that movie before. People thought that, well, once you have the parliament in place in 2012, then it's going to be legitimate. It's going to have a popular mandate to disarm the armed groups and move forward security sector. And as we heard, legitimacy does not just come from, elections alone. Legitimacy is complex, and I really like this output performative legitimacy notion. So again, bottom line is I'm worried, and I think more attention needs to be focused on the security sector component.
Benedetta, two-minute response to the question.
I can, if I may, I can take 10 seconds on Libya, because I think Frederic already addressed it, and then take the remaining 1.5 on Ariel's point about incentives, because I thought it was very thought-provoking. On Libya, the question of whether current security assistance can then be delivered in a multilateral framework through NATO. I imagine that is the question. I would say we will wait and see. Of course, from an alliance perspective, the current position is NATO stands ready to provide advice and on defense and the area of defense and security and capacity building to Libya, should the leadership make such a request. So of course that goes back to the point that security assistance is something that is delivered upon a meeting between demand and interest of those who are offering. So it's an open question to which I really don't have much more to add. But on the point about the incentives, I think that on the one hand, I have a lot of on the one hand, as a recovering academic, I do like that, and I can already imagine my 2x2 looking at best cases. We can look at the full spectrum of incentives, from diplomatic recognition to financial incentive, all the way to training, and then look at on the other end of the sticks that can be used as levers, and see how the combination of those work. So maybe I will be happy to write that article. But meanwhile, if I step out of academia for a second, I'm tempted to say yes and no, because the measure to which those incentives are going to work, it is context specific. And it's not just context specific because every social political reality and every conflict reality is different, but it's also context specific because as a state provider, our own strategic interests are going to be involved in different ways. And one of simple insight is these things seem to work better when there is a desire to have a long-term commitment, desire to invest in a relationship, desire to provide necessary political goods, financial resources. In other words, it works where there's an interest to do so. If their interest is peripheral, then it's going to be unlikely that some levers that are used successfully where there's a high interest and a high level of commitment will work in another context. Which may be frustrating from the more academic point of view and also from a policy point of view, but it leaves this being very much of a dynamic relationship that depends also on our own interest as international community intervening, and then of course put on the relationship with the state in the country where we are intervening, because again, the principal basis of security assistance is delivered on the basis of a request from a government. It is not delivered against the government's own will. So that also changes the relationship and completely constrains the realm of the possible.
Right. Let's thanks very much indeed, Benedetta. I'm trying to fit as many questions as possible. That there is, in addition to reacting to Jim's question, Vanda and Yaniv, this is more directed, I guess, at Vanda. On the Biden administration's decision to disengage from the Middle East, in quotation marks, I guess, but also specifically the withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan. Do you think those two will see, and this is from Kazim Uka, apologies if I mispronounced that. Will we see a political resurgence of groups such as ISIS and the Taliban? So perhaps, yeah, should we start with you, Vanda, and then we'll switch to Yaniv, so you can take both Jim's question and Kazim's question.
May I suggest the opposite order, maybe Yaniv, and I can pivot us to the Taliban?
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah, that actually makes a lot more sense. Yaniv, the floor is yours.
There you go. I think Jim's question is quite fascinating. I don't think we can speak of non-state armed actors as in any way contributing to the good of society. You know, these are armed groups geared toward fighting. But we can say that some of these groups, at least some of these militias, they do represent their. Some of these groups represent their community. Some of these groups were formed or emerged out of the need to protect their people from outside aggression. So we didn't get a chance to discuss much the case of Syria, for example, but this is a case I've been working on a lot recently. So, for example, the pro-government militias, the NDF, they emerged not necessarily out of greed or search for political power. They emerged because the communities that they hailed from were feeling threatened by some of the Islamist organizations, for example. So they and they allied themselves with the regime for that purpose. Now, by allying themselves with the regime, they, of course, they were involved in atrocities. They were involved in targeting the local population. But it also allowed some of these communities, right, especially the Christians or the Druze or the Ismailis, it also enabled them to carve themselves a place in the center of power, right? So I can distinguish such actors from other types of non-state armed groups, right? For example, the PMF that I mentioned, or even some of the Berti militias. So yeah, we can't speak of these actors necessarily as forces, but we can understand why they operate. And this goes back to the point that I made about the need to be, need to take a more nuanced position toward how we treat these militias, especially as part of post-conflict resolution. I hope I answered this question.
Thanks very much, Yaniv. Vanda?
If I might start with Jim's question that Yaniv was just talking about, I would suggest that perhaps the question of good versus bad is not the most important question. And what really matters from the perspective of local populations and even outside actors is, are they better or not than the alternative? Whether the alternative is the state that could be absent and brutish, or whether the alternative is other non-state armed actors. And to what extent they are responsive to some extent, how they engage with local populations, what kind of scope for negotiations they provide, and what kind of stability they provide. In a lot of my work around the world, I find that local people find it far easier to adapt to and hence accept a brutal rule that's predictable, but for which a development of standard and predictable coping mechanisms is possible, than in fact a contested and capricious rule that features very little stability, even if it features looser tightness on population control. And it's one of the reasons why a group like the Taliban is so powerful and on its way to, in my view, becoming a significant actor, perhaps the dominant actor in the future Afghan government. A situation that Afghanistan, even before the withdrawal of US forces, but certainly compounded by the withdrawal of US forces, is a country that has little chance, in my view, to preserve the existing political dispensation. And we are seeing many dramatic renegotiations and reorganization militarily of the social and political dispensation. And I think it's almost inevitable outcome that the Taliban will come to power. The question to me is how much bloodshed is spent beforehand, how rapidly is that arrival as much negotiated with power brokers that are peeling off or will be peeling off from the government, how rapidly Afghan security forces will fall apart, and is the Taliban, once in power, going to be able to be sufficiently inclusive, at least with respect to minority, if not nice, it is an odious actor, to sustain itself in government, or its governmental role going to be very unstable because of the way it's not able to respond to both internal impulses and power brokers and external actors. But that's actually a great example to one of the issues that I wanted to come to, which is that in a lot of our conversation, we have been focusing on militias, pro-government militias, or at least militias that are against actors like Taliban and Shabab. And those are complex issues. I would posit that it gets even more complicated if we expand the conversation of non-state armed actors to precisely focus on actors like Shabab, like the Taliban, like the Sinaloa cartel, that are not just featuring all the problems of pro-state armed militias, but are now against us. They are against the international actors. They might have been involved in international terrorism. We are able to defeat some, but not all of them. And some of them, Shabab is stronger than it's been at any point since 2016, 2015. The situation in Somalia is enormously precarious, and in Afghanistan, I am making the daring comment that the Taliban is on its way to becoming an actor in the Afghan government. Perhaps the dominant, likely a very strong actor in the Afghan dominant. So the issue becomes even more complex. Whatever shaping mechanisms and criteria, principles, or at least decision-making trees we are able to put forth toward the guys that are at least nominally on our side, it becomes all the more difficult in how we engage with the guys that are against us, but that are either ruling de facto or ruling in reality. And I don't think that we are in a position to outline a set of principles that will hold across all species. But nonetheless, the reality is that very likely we will move out of the domain where our only response is punitive, whether it's coercively punitive through military means, or it's punitive through sanctions and financial sanctions, financial punitive actions. And that there will be far more engagement and negotiations, quid quo, and other shaping mechanisms. I do believe that there is a whole set of shaping mechanisms that one can apply even to the ones against us. When I do my law enforcement work, I often say that the purpose of law enforcement is to make good criminals, as opposed to eliminate criminals, a very controversial, provocative statement on purpose. But I think we're heading into that space. And my final complicated comment to all of that is that it's a new geopolitical era. We, the West, are not the sole actors determining the engagement with the non-state armed actors. And although the next 20 years or so might well be about US-China rivalry and dealing with actors like Russia, both of those countries are already heavily engaging with non-state armed actors or moving rapidly into that space. And their principles, their operating guidelines might be radically different than ours, but will make for even more complicated space.
Thanks so much, Vanda. There's certainly a lot to take in there. At some point, I would like all the panelists to address this question of coercion, which carries a lot of political implications, unintended consequences. So I do wonder how much of an option that really is. The idea of an external actor. I'm assuming we're talking about an external actor or a combination of external and local, as a means through which to contain or eliminate some of these actors. So something to think about. But let's bring in another question from the audience. Jacob Eriksson, let's give you the floor. floor is yours, Jacob. And if you could introduce yourself.
Thanks, Ranj. I'm Jacob Eriksson from the University of York. Thank you very much for this panel. I guess I have a question that touches on this issue of distinguishing good from bad non-state actors. And I wonder if part of this has to do with thinking about how or whether we can distinguish between how different non-state actors relate to the state and how we think about what the boundaries of the state are. And I'm struck by the Iraqi example that we've been talking about and that I work on in my own research, where in Iraq, for example, we have the Hashid, which is simultaneously part of, yet distinct from the state and operates its own agenda. Whereas we also have more localized tribal militia that are either non-state actors or part of the Hashid umbrella. And so if the localized tribal militia had a more direct relationship with the state through a government ministry, but still had more flexibility to effectively remain as a non-state actor, wouldn't that be preferable rather than being mediated through the parastate institution of the Hashid? So Yaniv, perhaps, but anyone else is welcome to reflect on this question. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much indeed, Jacob. So Yaniv, others, feel free to respond to that. So let's start with you, Benedetta, and then Yaniv.
Oh no, Yaniv first, for sure.
Okay, yeah, Yaniv.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
And sorry, just to interject. We're aiming for clinical, snappy responses there, so we can really get to the crux of some of these issues. Yaniv, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely. So I'll try to make it concise. Absolutely. I mean, if we go back to the days of the Sahwa movement and Abdan Iraq, the reason that the Sahwa was supported by the coalition and the government was the fact that they actually accepted the legitimacy of the state, and what they try to do is to maintain the independence in Anbar, in Salah ad-Din, without being absorbed by the state. And for some time, it actually created a sense of stability in Iraq. So in a sense, I think it really supports what you suggested, Jacob, right? If we actually allow these actors to preserve some of their autonomy, in the short term, at least, it can contribute to the stability of the state. And this is why we need to be really cautious about how we categorize these actors and how we treat them.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Yaniv. Benedetta, please.
30 seconds follow up, and I think that's a really good. I cannot help it because I spent many years studying Hezbollah, which also has this mention of insider, outsider, elected political party, non-statutory armed movement, in government through municipal governments, providing outside-based governance through its welfare and charity basis. It's a fascinating question, and I think, in principle, yes, it makes a lot of sense to say, well, if there is a relationship with the state, doesn't that make that group more accountable and more likely to play by the rules? I would say, in theory, yes. In practice, it really depends on what the relationship with the state is like. Who is telling who what to do? Let's not assume necessarily that is the state or the ministry telling the paramilitary group what to do. It may very well be the opposite case. And in terms of balance of power, it may well be, especially in the case brought up, that is exactly the opposite. And then I am less sure that that's a mechanism for accountability, and put a question mark on whether that's not actually a mechanism to chip away on the state's ability to provide. So it depends on what the relationship is like, effectively.
Thanks so much, Benedetta. Ariel, I believe you had a reaction to that as well.
Yes, I did. One of the assumptions about the international community is that states want to be strong and centralized, that the president or the prime minister really, when they go to bed at night, they wish that they had a strong centralized army. And in fact, we know that there are lots of circumstances where the president and the prime minister don't wish that at all, that they deliberately prefer to have a constellation of armed non-state actors surrounding them, precisely because it's easier to manage and to control. Yes, and if they were living in Denmark, perhaps they would want to have a strong centralized army. But that assumption is proven wrong consistently. And I think it also works in the opposite direction, that we often assume that these militiamen would, if they were given a choice, they would put on their uniforms and join the army and take a pension and do those things, which is also, in some circumstances might be true, but is also incorrect. I think, Fred, you know very well from Libya how many groups, given the choice between joining the army and remaining independent, they choose independence. And so there are multiple actors who are in favor of the devolution of violence, this decentralization. It's not as Benedetta said, it's not a glitch in the system. It's the system itself that is generating it. And I think the sooner that we can rid ourselves of the assumption that the world wants to be a strong centralized state, the easier it will be to start inventing more effective policy solutions. Raj, I think your sound cut for a second there.
You're on mute.
Sorry, yeah, apologies. Seem to have muted automatically. Fred, I'd like to bring you in. Somebody who's served in the military, who's now at the very heart of the policy-making ecosystem in DC. This question of coercion, which we've heard on so many occasions today and elsewhere, coercion to address the plethora of problems, whether it's trying to hold militias accountable, whether it's trying to, bring about a more viable post-conflict transition, whether it's to enhance, improve, legitimize state institutions. Is coercion really an option? And what do we, or should we really mean by the use of force in these contexts? No doubt there's a lot to draw on from Libya's recent ongoing conflict, one could say, dare I say. I'd like to give you the floor to answer that question, Fred.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we have to put this in the context of the mood in Washington and the United States after, how many years of the so-called forever war, and this real, relooking at force as an instrument of national power. And, and again, the mood in Washington is, we're not going to go around slaying dragons anymore. And we're dialing back. There is, an appreciation now for a whole of government approach to foreign policy. You had Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, what he calls integrated deterrence, a deterrence in which the military is subordinate to diplomacy. And this is refreshing, to hear. And so I think with regard to armed groups, no, I mean, the coercion is not going to be the default now. And I do think that will entail what someone said, what Vanda said will be, compromises, quid pro quo, negotiations, some moral flexibility perhaps, right, in terms of these norms and delivering the minimum, human security, learning to live with the world as it is, not as the way we wish it should be. And again, we've had too much of this, right? And so, I mean, those are just some broad, philosophical, thoughts. My first impulse, having been a military, attaché and worked in the security assistance community, is let's scrutinize our impulse again to just throw security assistance, to do train and equip, to back up the state immediately, because as we've heard, the state does cause more problems, and it's not always the preferred solution. And so just to leave you again, this whole of government approach to dealing with the problem of armed groups, how can we manage the space in which they operate using tools like development assistance, media, outreach to civil society. I think that's the direction that we're headed in.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Fred. Perhaps, on this occasion, we might have run out of time, but certainly next time, the economic dimensions and the political economy of all this is also very fundamental. I'm going to give each of you 20 seconds. I want you to assume you've just taken office in a combination of Libya, maybe Iraq, potentially, try and imagine some other alternative country where you've got a combination of the Hezbollahs, the PMFs of this world, some actors you can negotiate with. What's the one policy you would immediately prioritize? And normally that's a question of, the more immediate, whether it's coercion, sanctions, punitive measures. It could be political, building political alliances, or it could be, you know, more medium-term, long-term SSR, DDR approaches, sticking with the more conventional. So you've each got about 15 seconds each to respond to that. Let's start with you, Benedetta. A good 15 seconds.
Oh dear. Banal but true. First things first, do no harm. So take actual stock of what else is happening before initiating any new program on intervention. Look what's going on at the bilateral, multilateral level, understand power players, and invest in building some political capital before doing anything else. So I'll kick it off.
Okay, we'll let you get away with that one. That's fine. Benedetta, Yaniv.
Perhaps overcome the instinct to purge, trying to find a way to integrate the elites, the leaders of these militias in the center of power.
Okay. Fred?
Again, learning to live with hybridity, this gray area of informal and formal. And then I think finally, again, do no harm, and also harmonize the security track with the political and the economic. Keep those three tracks in balance when you're doing conflict resolution.
Vanda?
Understand that the road to good intentions is a hellish one. So that means think of every single intervention as constant political calibration and building of political supporters, and perhaps weakening some of the political actors.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Vanda. Ariel?
Think about all of the things that can be done without the state's involvement and try and move in that direction.
Wonderful. Okay, that's very much to the point. Still very broad. We'll certainly come back to that question next time.
Branches, we need yours. So this was terrific, but you need to come.
We've literally got 60 seconds left, actually. But look, I'll say I'm a big fan of building political alliances. For me, it does come down to the politics of it all. And you know, I could say learn from the past, etc. But you know, that would be a bit of a cop out. Let me thank everybody for their contributions. I'd like to give the floor to Vanda, my colleague at the Brookings Institution, and of course, director of the Initiative on Nonstate Armed Actors, our co-host for today. Vanda, please.
Well, thank you very much, Ranj, for organizing the event, for allowing us to join on it, for your terrific work at the initiative and more broadly. And thanks to all of my colleagues on the panel, including you, Ranj, for just a stellar conversation. I learned tremendous amount, and we also just started peeling and discovering the layers of complexity, and I couldn't have hoped for a better set of colleagues on the panel to be exploring those issues. So I look very much forward to reading all of your work, and I hope that in half a year, we can do a repeat and think about some of the other issues that Ariel put on the table, the new geopolitics and how that intersects. Finally, my thanks to the audience, terrific questions, terrific engagements. I look very much forward to continuing the conversation with all of us.
Thanks very much indeed, Vanda. It's been a real privilege and honor. And once again, thank you. A huge thanks to the audience for their questions, interventions, and of course to all our speakers. We look forward to hosting you again as we continue this discussion. Thanks very much indeed.